Okay, so let's get back into it here. We're kind of wrapping up our section on impacts to wildlife, which is pretty straightforward as far as this class goes. We're not getting into the deep species-specific pathology of ingesting a bunch of plastic particles, for example. We're looking at across land mammals, for example, what happens when you swallow a bunch of plastic garbage trying to feed in a beach habitat, for example. So we're not really interested in a species-specific level because everybody's picked a very different national park this semester to investigate this stuff at, and we can't speak at that level of specificity. But we're kind of getting this idea that, yeah, this is difficult, it's a thing. And we kind of left off talking last week about essentially what are some impacts of climate change on wildlife. And specifically, we're talking about that thermal island or the sky island effect. Everybody kind of remember where we left off? All right, cool. So that's a really powerful thing. And because a lot of our national parks tend to protect, be draped around, sort of drop a polygon onto the map around very tall things, we get the sky island effect, or we get sort of the canyon effect in the opposite direction, right? So a brief factoid I mentioned last week is that at the Grand Canyon, there can be as much as a 70-degree temperature differential at the top of the north rim of the Grand Canyon at about 9,000 to 9,500 feet elevation, down to the bottom of the canyon, which is more than a mile away downward. It can be literally 100 degrees down at the bottom of the canyon at like Phantom Ranch and literally snowing up on the rim. That is a thing. So we want to kind of think about not just the general slow heating effect on wildlife and their sky islands or their canyon habitat or wherever else they're at. We also want to think about what are the more specific zoom in on the temperature fluctuation graph, right? The peaks get higher, the valleys get colder, we get more energy expressed in terms of atomic bombs per minute, atomic explosions per minute, Hiroshima level explosions, expressed in things like intensified hurricanes, right? So you may have heard recent presidents talking about defusing hurricanes by exploding nuclear weapons in them. That was kind of a misapprehension of this idea of the scale of energy, megatons of TNT worth of joules of energy being sort of boiled off in our atmosphere by intensified storms swirling around. If you want to think about the scale of climate change, as the Arctic is melting and refreezing each winter and then melting a little bit more and refreezing a little bit less each year, right? It's kind of breathing in and out on an annual basis, and we get to blue ocean in the Arctic, no Arctic ice cap, or a much smaller Arctic ice cap with navigable waters for the first time in human history. Real soon now, right? So that graph is basically at it's getting to zero. So as that ice cap retreats, that very bright white, high albedo or high reflectance ice cap, once that's gone a little bit more, it's a little bit less able to reflect, hundreds of watts, sometimes up to a kilowatt or more of solar energy insolation hitting that square meter of surface that is now dark colored ocean water instead of being very light colored snow and ice. So the scale of climate change is such that the extra addition of more dark colored ocean surface up in the Arctic is a Hiroshima level nuclear weapon detonating once every few seconds on average, all day long, all year long, right? That's a lot of thermal energy extra that's getting sucked into the ocean and does a little bit better job of melting this down and so forth. So at very high latitudes, North Pole, South Pole, we have exaggerated effects of climate change on wildlife. And polar bears, of course, we're all familiar with the idea of polar bears functionally running out of effective feeding habitat completely, and possibly going away in our lifetimes as a sort of global phenomenon. Like polar bears kind of at the top end of a whole bunch of continents. That may be one of the more visible ways to kind of take a look at it. All right, so when you are managing a desert park or a seaside coastal national park for our purposes this semester, you want to think about, okay, so exogenous climate change that is originating outside my park. I don't have a bunch of industrial carbon pollutants entering the atmosphere from my park as a function of human activity. Even so, that factory belching carbon or that intensified forest fire half a planet away is slowly etching away at your local park's climate ability to support wildlife, especially in these more marginal ecosystems. Very high elevation, very dry, very low elevation, very hot, very cold places. Whatever that is intensified as those temperature swings get bigger and bigger. Okay, so something to just kind of keep in mind. And then of course we have stuff like non-native invasive species, domesticated pigs turning into wild boars very quickly, or feral hogs, we want to call them. The Park Service has had to learn a tough lesson on sort of public perception of what do you call feral domesticated animals so that you can be free to manage them. Gary knows exactly what I'm talking about. In southern Missouri, this is a big problem. In places like Texas, feral swine alone cause millions of dollars of damage because they are smart, they're mobile, they can breed rapidly, and they can really shred an area. Has anybody seen like a feral pig or a wild boar wallow in the forest? How would you describe that to somebody if somebody needed to walk through a forest and be safe and avoid certain things like getting gored by feral swine? How would you describe a hog wallow?
A hole big that screen about 2 feet deep.
Yeah, and everything that used to be growing there, not growing there anymore, right? So this isn't like wholesale destruction of an entire forested environment, but for like feral hogs, for feral horses, again, it's not the black stallion, it's a feral horse eating your native or restoration ecology hard work, just eating it to the ground or tearing it up and destroying it and so forth. And unfortunately, with factory farming at the scale that it is in certainly here in the United States, and our heavy use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and so forth, we're pretty good at producing crops, which means we're pretty good at producing like A+ feeding habitat for deer. I was talking with a couple of guys a few nights ago, and one local farmer here in southern Illinois lost a 56-acre soybean field completely destroyed by overpopulated deer, right? And so when you have feral hogs who are every bit as hungry as deer and so forth, and they don't have any natural predators in place like whitetail these days, we run into situations like this where it's not like a hog here or there and man, let me just take the rifle out and get a varmint permit and just go hog wild. It is a huge problem, like not a funny problem, like a real big issue. So because they go feral so quickly, and because they can produce large litters rapidly, this is a major area of concern. Especially with a place like Ozark Scenic Riverways, where we went on our field trip. the entire riverways is covered by forest land and row crop farmland. So this is an issue, and I've run across some pretty hefty looking hog wallows searching for visitor created trails at Ozark Scenic Riverways. So this is,
Quite a few hogs on there.
yeah, there's a lot. And they're pretty smart too. Pigs are fairly intelligent. They require to really eradicate them, to extirpate them. They require some pretty hard work. So have you guys seen like any of the wildlife shows on OLN or anything like that where they're doing stuff down in Texas? What's the scale of the response required for controlling hogs down in Texas? And notice that I'm saying controlling, I'm not saying eradicating. I'm not saying solving the problem, I'm just saying not getting completely destroyed by it, right? There's a big difference in vocabulary there. You don't want to leave that behind. Has anybody ever seen any of those shows? Right? This is people in helicopters with military grade night vision optics and like precision sharpshooter training because it's that bad.
We got a helicopter in Van Buren full time now for,
Yeah.
they got one down just for us.
Yeah. So think about what that means for you as a park ranger, right? Some farmer didn't repair his fences or her fences and let slip some hogs, they get loose, and now it's your problem. And you have to pay for a helicopter, which is not a cheap piece of equipment. You got to maintain a helicopter, which is, as any of you who have worked in helicopter maintenance with the military know, not cheap. And to pay the pilot, not cheap. So, for example, in search and rescue, the quote is, "We can't turn a rotary wing aircraft and not spend $5,000." So you don't do search and rescue with a helicopter unless you absolutely need to do that. And in a lot of our parks, of course, the terrain is so insane, you do need to. And so you're on the hook for that. And there's a lot of good forestry work you could do. You didn't have to pay for that helicopter, and that pilot, and those sharpshooters, and those night vision optics, and all of the regulatory and compliance paperwork that you gotta put multiple people on in the office to file paperwork so you can be shooting around populated areas. Like, this is a big, hairy, expensive deal.
It's real neat now. They got a couple guys with drones and they go up.
Yeah.
They're like 4 or 5 drones at a time.
Yeah.
And when they'll be in different areas and they locate pigs, they radio the helicopter in.
Yeah.
And then the drone stays up there to see if they separate. They'll follow each one, and while they're doing that, there'll be another drone in another area. And once they locate somebody, radio copter over.
Yeah, very much the same approach or strategy as in more military applications, right? You need spotters for calling those shots, and drone work is very, very useful for that. Drone work is also problematic in that those drones, we'll get to in our human resources section with technologies, drones are extremely disruptive to your prey population. So your deer, elk, bison, stuff like that. Drones are blanket outlawed in all national parks, period. Except for very narrow special use permits like documentary filmmaking, for example. You have to file like a year in advance and pay a whole bunch of money and stuff like that. And the Park Service gets to vet all of your flight plans and shut you down in making your documentary or filming your wedding or whatever it is within a special use permit. If it's anywhere near any of their vulnerable prey ungulated populations, like elk and bison are just trying to die, stampeding off a cliff or breaking legs as they panic from not ever in their evolutionary histories having to cope with something like a drone and even figuring out what it is, right? So you don't fly drones around horses that people are riding. You never fly drones around wildlife that could be hurt in a panic as a result of that. And so drones are the right tool. Like, you need drones with FLIR, forward-looking infrared optics, to like spot and keep tracking wildlife to eradicate or get population densities and so forth. But your hands are kind of tied on when and where you can do that. You have to kind of cross-check it with your park biologists on, all right, we want to run a mission. We think there's a bunch of swine over in grid area XYZ. Where are the elk right now? You know, we don't want to cause any elk to break their legs as a function of trying to hunt out swine that we never let out into the park, but somebody has made it our problem. So, as a result, we are looking at everything, all kinds of different solutions for dealing with this stuff. For example, if any of you guys and gals throwing out, you like bacon, right? Bacon is preserved with nitrate or nitrites, if you get the more shelf-stable kinds. And although there is not really any safe dosage of nitrites in terms of human carcinogenicity, it is an effective food preservative, ironically enough. And the primary edible form of nitrates and nitrites are as metal salts, so like sodium nitrate, sodium nitrite, magnesium nitrate, stuff like that. Which is part of why cured bacon tastes so salty and delicious. The other part of that is the lard. That's the secret ingredient. It's not love, it's lard. So people are trying everything. There's research going on right now of can we put out food bait traps for feral swine just absolutely loaded with delicious sodium nitrite to the point that the swine literally eat themselves to death. We'll see how that goes. But that's a thing, and we are looking for all ways to do this, because if the swine eats a whole bunch of sodium nitrite, falls over dead, and we find it in time, there's this open question of, has the boar or sow, pig, conveniently preserved itself for human consumption, right? So sometimes it's an integrated pest management kind of an approach like this. Sometimes it is something else. Okay. So brown marmorated stink bugs, pretty bad deal as well if you're not familiar with this. One of the complications of impacts is that, again, impacts for this class, they can be positive or negative. So, for example, when Washington, D.C. put in its light rail system. Has anybody ever been to Washington, D.C. before? All right, it is absolutely horrendous, like gridlock level traffic on the outer belt going around Washington, D.C. So there's a light rail system that conveniently accesses all parts of all the very expensive neighborhoods outlying and inlying that outer belt. Rush hour starts in Washington, D.C. shortly after 5 in the morning and lets off briefly in the afternoon after lunch before it starts picking back up, and it is not at all uncommon to still have stop-and-go traffic on that outer belt at 9, 10 o'clock at night, right? So there's a limited few hours each day when you don't have insane traffic. So a light rail system makes a lot of sense in terms of urban planning in places like Washington, D.C. What we're talking about this for with respect to wildlife is that certain species, in particular coyote, have adapted to ride light rail systems. And there are lots and lots of clips on YouTube and TikTok and stuff like that if you want to get scattered by the Chinese government that show coyote getting on and getting off of light rail systems in places like Washington, D.C. This is not an unexpected thing at that point. Okay, so when we talk about impacts, we need to think about what are the adaptive strategies that certain more mobile species like ravens, other corvids, jays, crows, for example, very intelligent bird species and highly mobile, how are they going to use those habitat impacts, right? We put in a road through a bunch of their habitat, and they're going to respond to that. We're going to push them into our neighborhoods, right? And we're all familiar with trash pandas, raccoons. It's another species that has adapted really well to things like urban environments. So pigeons, for example, as a wildlife species, not doing terrible in cities, all right? They cause a lot of damage too. So it's not all negative impacts, but we can't just assume that it is like this. All right, so this is a video at Rocky Mountain National Park of, I believe those are coyote droppings at the Glacier Gorge trailhead. And the canids in the park, because they're not stupid, use the extensive network of trails through the park to get around, because it's a lot more efficient than trying to crash through Rocky Mountain underbrush. Okay? Cool. So, that's not at all an uncommon thing. So the caption here, if you can't read it from the back of the room, when winter comes, deer typically wander the plains and woodlands, stopping outside cabins or homes where they can see the red glow of Netflix playing from inside. We'll talk about nighttime resources later on, but here's an example of a moose walking down the median and causing a moose jam. Do you see the car in the oncoming lane reversing to try and get a cool cell phone video? And the person on this side slowing down to get a cool cell phone video, right? So now everybody's in danger, not just the moose, okay? But this is a function of the moose's habitat and travel corridor habitat specifically getting impacted to the point where its best strategy is to walk down the middle of a divided highway, which is not a great strategy, but it makes sense from the perspective of the moose and its limited risk analysis. Okay? So, there's a little healthcare joke. We're all gonna die young. Okay. So wildlife are going to adapt. They're going to respond, and they're going to put pressure on humans as humans put pressure on them. Encroachment is kind of one term for this phenomenon. This is not a surprise to anybody, but we gotta mention it. Okay? So, there's a couple more of those videos of elk at Grand Canyon. We've seen these, so we're not going to spend more time on it, but mature bull elk, getting ready for the rut in a couple of months, got a massive rack, and so forth. Okay? So, you've seen, I believe, a bunch of these. Okay? So, behavior modification is going to be the response to it. We'll get into those in specific here in a bit. Breeding disturbance is going to be another major class of impact that is not typically very visible. Okay, so when we have a moose running down the middle of the road in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, wherever they are taking advantage of that highway system, that's pretty visible, right? There's a bunch of cars that are going to slow down and take that cell phone video. But when our activities are causing breeding disturbance, that's a lot less visible. That's a lot less visible. And so when we see natality, that is successful live birth rates, dropping down, we want to take a look not only at the number of hit by vehicle accidents that we can keep an easy tally of, but look at heat maps of human presence. Are hiking trails bringing humans into contact with elk during the very sensitive rut? Which is a terrible idea for multiple reasons, because, male elk, like, university age people, get kind of crazy-eyed during the rut. So, we want to understand that this is a much more subtle thing and pretty hard. There's a lag effect. It takes several good years of non-disturbed breeding to make up for a single year of disturbed breeding, because the numbers drop down and those numbers are still low in successive years. So it takes extra effort to bring it back up. It's just like with grades. So if you have a great first 2 tests out of 4 in a class, and then kind of bomb the third, and then pull it out of the fire with the 4th test, you're going to be fine. But it's hard work to pull your grade up from a low first test. Your average climbs much more slowly. Okay? So this is the thing. We impact animals quite a bit. So when I'm talking about reduced natality or reproductive failure outright, that's going to be a massive problem. So 7% year-on-year reduction in natality for elk disturbed in parks. That's like a population collapse rate. If you're making 7% on your investments, you're going to retire rich. If you are paying 7% on a mortgage, you're going to pay more than twice the total household cost, right? Compound math is absolutely brutal. Albert Einstein, a pretty smart guy about math, said that there is no force in the universe more powerful than compounding, percentage math. All right, so 7% reduction year on year with disturbed elk populations versus undisturbed elk populations. That's getting into collapse pretty fast. Okay, so we talked about overpopulation in small rodents based on food microtrash in campgrounds. So we see an infestation of mice, rats in some places, and so forth. Like all sorts of different species, kangaroo rats in more arid places. And then the snakes coming in behind them, and then exterminators coming in behind the snakes, and people getting sick with stuff like hantavirus, humans getting sick with hantavirus based on mouse vectored viruses, the virus in their feces. Okay? So, these are not academic concerns. This is make or break it for populations of wildlife at your park. So, all of these points here on this and the next few slides, ask yourself, what are the major populations of wildlife? What are the key species of interest in my park? Right? You've had a chance to get to know your park a little bit, so you probably know, top 3 species: bald eagles, or elk, or desert tortoises, or manatee, or whatever. What am I looking at here? Reproductive disturbance? Habitat fragmentation? Is it they're eating microtrash and eating a bunch of wrappers? It is they are getting hit by vehicles when they cause a species name jam. Right? So be running through this list in your head, with your park's wildlife species. Typically, some of the outstanding and most beautiful and amazing and of visitor interest species are the most vulnerable to not only non-native invasive species competition, so swine going feral in your park, turning into boars within a matter of weeks. They start to grow those bristles and lose that soft, pink, and delicious look to them, and turning into wild Timon and Pumbaa looking animals. It is also non-native invasive species introduction that outcompetes their food sources. Okay, so when horses are coming in with non-local hay seed in their feces or droppings, they poop that on the trail, the rain washes any viable seeds into the soil at the trail's edge, and now we've got non-native grasses right where the horses are going to be eating, so they can spread it more, and so forth. And pretty soon the native grasses that didn't have to survive against invasive, aggressive, colonizing species, now they do. Okay? And removal of keystone species as well. All right, so this is pretty depressing. Does anybody have any questions or insights about wildlife impacts? If we impact any of our other resources, we can see the outcome of that in our wildlife populations, literal indicator species, right? So this is going to be one of those that's kind of pretty close to the middle of the Venn diagram or the web diagram of how do impacts relate to each other. How does one impact potentiate or make stronger or worse another impact? Okay? Any questions? All right. Good deal. Let's end this particular show. And